right? So Jeff, where does your morality come from? Karen wants to know.
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeremy. Actually, as fate would have it, it's not just internet trolls who are asking this question, because I was recently home for the holidays and was visiting some old friends, and an old friend of mine who I was talking to about the podcast and how my faith has changed and blah blah blah. So this was news to him that I wasn't a Christian anymore, and he asked me this exact same question, right? So this is not an internet troll. This is a smart person who, I like him, he likes me, we're friends. And he was totally surprised, and he said, "Oh, wow, I'm surprised to hear that, because I always thought of you as a really moral person. Like, what's the deal?" And then his follow-up question was, "So, if there's no God, what is right and wrong?" Like, his go-to was, "What about bestiality? Like, why is that wrong?"
Wow, that's where he went with it?
That was his first follow-up question, yeah.
Which should tell you something, but I don't know.
So I wish I had chapter and verse. So I'll just say, just for the record, Exodus 22:19 and Leviticus 20:15. That's why you're not supposed to have sex with animals. Otherwise, free game. Okay, so where does morality come from? Is it too self-congratulatory and highfalutin to say I'm striving to do good for its own sake? So I remember years ago when I was a Christian, the first time someone pointed out to me that if you're following Jesus, it's in some ways it's a lower form of morality, because Jesus is always talking about your heavenly reward and divine punishment for doing right and wrong. And at first I was kind of surprised to hear that. I was like, no, Jesus is the height of morality. And then I thought about it, and I started noticing that more and more as I was reading the teachings of Jesus. He is constantly talking about, you should do good, and you should not tell anyone else that you're doing good, but you'll have treasure in heaven. You'll be rewarded later, and vice versa. If you do bad, you'll be punished later. So I think that Christians certainly can be good people. Obviously, there's all kinds of examples of Christians who've formed hospitals and orphanages and done all kinds of charitable work. That stuff is all great. But I wonder if we can get past that as a society. One of my favorite quotes ever of Jesus, where he's talking about you should do good. So in Matthew 25:35, talking about caring for the poor, the needy, he says, "For I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty, you gave me a drink. I was a stranger, you invited me into your home. I was naked, you gave me clothing. I was sick and you cared for me. I was in prison, you visited me. I tell you the truth, when you did it for one of the least of these, you did it for me." So beautiful passage. Love that quote from Jesus. I think about it all the time when I think about how can I be helping other people in this world. So I think that's a really important saying of Jesus, and I think that's a great principle, and it's deeply meaningful for people. Of course, I think for some people it's important to try to help the poor, help their fellow man, because they believe that they're secretly blessing Jesus by doing these charitable works. Mm-hmm. But I think if you can help the poor just because you care about the poor person, just because you care about your fellow man, I think potentially that's even better. To take myself off my high horse a little bit, I want to acknowledge that I'm not sure if you could ever be a truly pure, righteous person, right? Let's say I don't have Jesus anymore and I want to help people. Is it possible even to truly help someone just to do good for its own sake? Or is there always that secret motive of when I'm helping someone else, I'm secretly just doing it to make myself feel good about myself? I think that's kind of an open question, and I'm not totally sure about. But I think just doing good for its own sake is an ideal that we can all strive for.
I like that. I'm trying to think of which book I read. I don't know if it was Hitchens or who, but that atheist argument of, if the only reason you're doing good is because you are going to get some reward from your God, then that's a flawed reason to do good, which I think is actually a very compelling argument as to why are we doing good, and is there something just inherently in that? So when you look at Romans 1 and Paul's argument of creation revealing some sense of God in your journey now, do you say, yeah, you do have some sense of a creator, or nope, that's not real, that's a figment of your imagination?
So I think I'd definitely still respond to kind of the cosmological argument in terms of like, how can you get something out of nothing? If the universe began to exist, there must be some outside force. Like that still makes sense to me of like, how do you have nature without some kind of creator? Even the fine tuning argument to some extent, though I know you could possibly explain that with just a long enough period of time. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I would stand behind the idea of, yeah, it's possible to make the argument that there must be some kind of creator, there must be some kind of God. It seems like almost a total non sequitur to say that God has to be the God of the Bible. And also, I'm not sure like how much that has to do with morality. You know what I mean? Like, if the natural world exists, that means there must be some kind of creator, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the creator like wants us to not murder each other or do other immoral acts, right?
Well, I think that's what what is it pointing you to is the next step of that question. So if we find some sense of a creator in creation, what does the creator look like? And that's where your view of God matters immensely, because if you view God as one thing, then you're going to respond accordingly, and if God's totally different than that, then you're going to change. And so if God looks like Jesus, then you should respond to a Jesus looking God and figure out what makes sense, But I don't think we spend enough time on our views of God. We just think I either believe God exists or I don't. It's like, okay, well, just because you're acknowledging something, what is it? Like, what do you actually think God looks like? And, describe it and put words to it. And, can you mentally picture God, or is God an abstract idea to you? When I think about God, I think about the face of Jesus. Like, and you've teased me on this. I always say the person of Jesus, right? Because Jesus isn't an idea. It's a person. It's something more relational than just a historical figure to me. And so I think it matters immensely. But I do think it's helpful for Karen. I doubt she's gonna listen to the podcast, but that you do have a sense of morality, and you've shattered that fourth wall, Jeff.
Well, thank you. Actually, can I circle back, because I forgot to mention something in my response, but I think it ties into what you're saying with the person of Jesus, right? So with the Matthew 25 passage, as I said, like he's making it personal, right? If you're just helping your fellow man, you're helping the stranger among you, you're actually helping the person of Jesus, right? Like I think that sentiment is great, but if you read that in context, Jesus is actually talking about the final judgment. He's saying like, if you did treat the poor well, then you're welcome into heaven. But if you failed to be kind to other people, then you're cast into hell. So how would you respond to that idea of Jesus using this carrot and stick incentive to try to get people to behave?
I think what you do matters, so I would definitely say if you decide to live your life neglecting the needy and the vulnerable around you, that matters to Jesus, and it matters to all the people around you, and it matters to who you become or don't become. Where I would say is I have no problem with Jesus and justice. I think this is where people with my theology get stereotyped and incorrectly. Well, if you don't believe in a literal hell, then there can be no sense of justice. Like no. It's just always a redemptive justice. It's not it's not a destructive justice. So I do think the sheep and goats, I do think there is a sense of like, hey, we're going to have to make these things right. And if you're constantly neglecting the needy around you, that is an affront on Jesus. Like literally God takes it very personal. It's not, hey, there's these people you should have cared about. It's like, no, it's me. And you neglected me because you would not love them, which for God to put, Jesus to put himself in the neediest role is just truly, that's a boggling analogy for God to say that, right? Like I am the very least of the least. And that's how, you treat me. But I do think use the words you want to use, a reckoning, justice, day of judgment. Sure, I'm fine with all of that. And I do think that Jesus will make that right. I do not think it's going to be punitive. I think it will be redemptive, both for the people that were wronged and the people doing the wrong, And I think that's where I would say, yeah, I think there is going to be something. I just think ultimately it doesn't change the nature of God. God doesn't suddenly become punitive. in that, but I do think there will be a sense of accountability. And I think that's the part that again, where when I get stereotyped, that nuance goes out the window, and it's like, well, then you don't care about justice. I literally saw someone argue one of my comments the other day, and I'm like, I don't have the energy to argue this, but like you're giving no nuance to any argument. And so, yeah.
No, that's good. I do think, because that's kind of an argument people will make for God, right? Of like just the natural human craving for justice, right? Because the world is an unfair place, and it seems like there must be some kind of final judgment, or there must be some kind of afterlife that will make all things right. Because if there's no afterlife, then life is unfair. And I guess for me, where I'm at is I'm kind of thinking like, yeah, that'd be nice if there's an afterlife, and the wicked will be punished or like redeemed, not punished eternally, because I don't believe that's right either. But yeah, I'm just not sure that that's true, or if that's more of the product of wishful thinking,
Well, and I love that. I believe that. So I understand why it can be seen as wishful thinking, because I'm grateful that I believe that Jesus will make things right eventually. And if you convince me that wasn't true, I think I would despair a lot more and have a much more like, what does any of it matter? You know what I mean? It's like the world sucks, pain's real, suffering's real, and then you die. And great if you were lucky enough to suffer less than others. I mean, it's just like, that would be a very hard, I think, worldview. And maybe I'm just not tough enough to accept it, Jeff. But I do believe Jesus will make all things right. In fact, someone on Twitter the other day asked, did like a little response like, "Hey, how would you describe heaven in one word?" So I stared at that for a second. I'm like, all right, what word comes to my mind? And I wrote back. I said redemption. Like, that's the way I would describe heaven, of like a redemption of all things. All that is broken is made right. And that, to me, and that includes oppressors and the oppressed, where if you've been oppressed, I think Jesus is going to make it up to you in profound ways. And if you were the oppressor, I think Jesus is going to figure out a way to make that right with you and, redeem you through that somehow. And it may not be a pleasant, I've talked about this, may not be a pleasant experience, but I don't think it's punitive. I think it's for your ultimate good. But I do think without that, it's a very different worldview.